Welcome to the Digital Authoritarianism podcast series. Each episode uncovers how digital technologies are reshaping authoritarian politics, revealing global and regional patterns of digital repression and the creative ways civil societies fight back, speaking to researchers, journalists, and activists. The hosts of this podcast are Janjira, Sangeeta, and Andreas, research fellows at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, Hamburg. We are glad to share this important conversation with you. Let's dive in.
Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of our podcast series on digital authoritarianism, brought to you by the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, or the GIGA. My name is Janjira Sombatpunsiri, Research Fellow at GIGA and co-lead of our project Digital Authoritarianism through Lawfare in Asia. In this project, we explore how legal practices and policies across South and Southeast Asia are being used to advance authoritarian control and restrict civil society rights. This initiative builds on our earlier research examining how governments in the region use information laws to criminalize dissent. As part of the work, we developed an online tracker. You see the address here, that way, fakenewslawfare.com. If you haven't seen it yet, I really encourage you to check it out. Now, to kick off our podcast series, I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome someone whose work I've admired for years, Jonathan Ong. Jonathan is the professor of global digital media at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the founding director of the Global Technology for Social Justice Lab, a creative space that champions community drive approaches to tech studies and digital justice. He's also one of the most prolific scholars in the field of disinformation research. One of his most cited works, and one that I personally find fascinating, examines the moral worlds of paid trolls in the Philippines, exploring how they see themselves and justify their work. Now, Jonathan is also part of the Carnegie Digital Democracy Network, which recently published a thought-provoking essay he co-authored on resources imbalance between fact-checkers and disinformation researchers in the global north and the global majority, and how shifting funding priorities impact advocacy for information integrity in the global majority. It is a very, very timely piece, especially at the moment when illiberal politics are resurging in places once seen as defenders of liberal democracy, including the US. And when big tech's commitment to information integrity seems to be fading out. So today, we'll unpack this shifting landscape, what's happening in the West, how it reverberates across the global South or the global majority, and what it means for those fighting against digital authoritarianism around the world. So, Jonathan, welcome to our podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you with us. To start off, could you briefly walk us through your recent essay? What's the biggest takeaway you want listeners to remember?
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations, Janjira. This is such an exciting initiative. I think you and I really share, a real passion to elevate voices from Asia, from Southeast Asia, a region where we're both from. I'm from the Philippines originally and now work here in the US. But I think now is really the time for Global South voices to really participate in tech policy discussions, especially as we see leadership from the US kind of like retreat, right, and fall backwards in the present political context. Yeah, and so I think a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, will be finding great insight. Yeah, and I'm so honored to be your first guest, Janjira.
Yeah, thanks so much for making the time for us. And can you walk us through
Yeah,
your essay in the Carnegie a little bit? Like, what would be the most
yeah.
important takeaway?
Absolutely. Yeah. Co-authored with Dean Jackson and also alongside other co-authors who have contributed to this study. We have produced, so like the bigger context of the essay is about South to South learning. So over the past couple of years, myself in the Philippines, to get connecting with civil society leaders in the Philippines. We've connected with Brazilian researchers, academics, and civil society, trying to facilitate South to South knowledge exchange. And really, the interest there was to learn from each other. So rather than apply insights from the global north and like copy, best practice legislation from the EU, which is often the case, we were thinking that shouldn't it be much more prudent to compare countries with similar experiences of
Mm.
authoritarian nostalgia, with similar experiences also implementing creative approaches to democratic innovation in their region, right? In Latin America for Brazil, Southeast Asia for Philippines. And
Mm.
so we wanted to really explore funding practices and how researchers and civil society on the ground could be better supported. And what we found through this comparative study between Brazil and Philippines, and then we expanded it to a wider network, and we had conducted interviews and workshops with representatives from over 13 countries,
Mm.
many from the global south as well. So, what we found was that some of the best practice tech accountability advocacies from the North don't always translate to the Global South, are not always shared by the Global South. And I think some of the quote unquote quote, more extreme cases would
Mm.
come from countries that are our neighbors in Southeast Asia, like Myanmar,
Mm.
right? So,
Mm.
right? Like the traditional approach of pro-democracy, tech and democracy advocacy is when there's an elections, social media platforms should be promoting it, should be like trying to get voters out, right? And try to get more publicity out. But Myanmar civil society leaders were actually asking Meta platforms to not promote an election that they consider fraudulent. So
Mm.
those kinds of things, and that's one extreme example. But we found other examples of, okay, here are fact-checking tools, here are databases and methodologies that we want you to test in your country, in Brazil and Philippines. We want you to gather examples in the local language of hate speech and misogyny.
Mm.
And people on the ground feel quite uncomfortable in some of these arrangements of like, what is this tool going to be used for? What is this very horrific expression of misogyny? How could it be repurposed? Is it for machine learning? Like, is it really to help us or to
Mm.
help you, our collaborator in Europe, to train your machine learning models? And to create like bigger data sets, right? So we wanted to dwell in those difficult discussions of how can international funding and collaborations be much more bottom up and empowering. And I
Mm.
hope that essay at least gives you some insight in terms of what we think would be better approaches.
Mm. Well, that's really fascinating. And I mean, this is the world that we're living in right now, right? The power imbalances is there, but at the same time, people from the global majority used to look up to so-called role model of democracy, of human rights, right? Of transparency. And these days, things get a little tricky, right? And I mean, in the US, where you are right now, I mean, we've seen big tech moving noticeably closer to illiberal political actors, right? And sometimes they've been appointed as officials who champion budget cuts, deregulation of the tech industries, and even dismantling federal agencies, often actually at the expense of content moderation on their platforms, right? So I'm just wondering, like, how do you think this growing alignment is shaping the disinformation ecosystem and the broader efforts to counter disinformation, not only in the US, where you live and work and do research, but also across the global majority?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I think you hit the nail right on the head, Junjira, that I think this trend of Silicon Valley corporations and private corporations, big tech corporations, and their alignment with Washington, D.C., that alignment has been there, and scholars, including my colleagues here at UMass, have written about shared commercial interests and also
Mm,
geopolitical interests. Those have been aligned in the past, but
mm,
now the kind of like the masks are off. Like now we can see
mm,
it in full view, and the fact that, for example, in the US, like guardrails around the development of artificial intelligence, Gen AI, have been lifted, right? Which is quite a dramatic move in response to the previous administration under Biden,
mm,
where yeah, social scientists were appointed to the AI Advisory Council, yeah, including some very good role models like Alondra
mm,
Nelson, who used to head the Social Science Research Council. So it was great to see critical social scientists, those who apply even, critical race theory to some of these
mm, mm, mm,
to explore issues as they impact private tech corporations. But now we will need to find that leadership elsewhere. I think
mm,
that's the main argument of my research over the past years,
mm,
that Global South voices have to come together to articulate our own vision of tech justice and tech accountability, and to be
mm,
much clearer in terms of what our priorities should be.
mm,
Yeah, so I think that's been the big question I throw at partners in civil
mm,
society, the question I throw to other academics in the global south, like when do our vision and priorities align with, and when do they diverge from some of the priorities of global north? And
mm,
here it's not just we should also make sure to give pause and to think about global north and global south not as monoliths, and also see specific
mm,
national country priorities, right? And
mm,
how
mm.
we might want to advocate for certain yeah, marginalized groups and minoritized groups within country as well. So I think that's a big question that's on top of everyone's minds.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree that this is the time where the global south, global majority have to step up, right? And basically have a say regarding, for example, community guidelines, how we can interject in the existing content moderation of platforms and issues like AI regulations, right? Now, the question I often get when we discuss the global south, right? Because the global south is so fragmented. Do you see any emerging normative kind of consensus, if you like, among the global south when it comes to issues like platform governance or AI governance?
Great question. So I've been in Brazil as a visiting
Mm,
professor for a couple months this year. So I spent
mm,
March, April as visiting professor in Minas Gerais in the Catholic University there, and also spent some time in the Federal University. And so this is really a part of that South to South learning exchange that myself and collaborators in Brazil have started since 2022. And for listeners, you might want to check out some of our studies in glotechlab.net.
mhm,
So um, I'm sure we can drop the link
Please do
in the
that.
notes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so one of the key frameworks that they've been advancing, and this is for our discussion as well, Janjira. I'm sure that you've heard about this term is digital sovereignty. So digital sovereignty is a framework that they're kind of like pushing forth in terms of, from my understanding, it's much more um, a framework that kind of like puts a premium on self-determination when it comes
Mm,
to what their
mm,
priorities are in the tech policy space. And
mm,
so Brazil has had has had several high-profile cases of their electoral court having very aggressive approaches to content moderation and content
mm,
policing,
mm,
including of Bolsonaro in the last election, the then sitting president
mm,
Bolsonaro. Several posts related to their campaign were taken down in
mm,
quite a controversial fashion.
mm,
Other approaches, they had also um, taken head on Elon Musk himself and
mm,
tried to argue for specific policies that they want implemented within a Brazilian jurisdiction. And so digital sovereignty is one key framework that like a middle power, like which is a term that we often hear, like when we talk about
mm,
Brazil
mm,
and countries like Indonesia, right?
mm,
Uh, Trying to advocate for like for a country with as big a user base as ours, with great resources as ours, we want to have more self-determination when it comes to what are specific policies of our country. I think this framework, and I've asked questions to Brazilian colleagues that the term sovereignty is very much a nation state kind of, for me,
right.
like
Yeah.
association, and therefore
Yeah.
it could easily very slip into a very national security frame,
Mm,
which emphasizes borders, military, policing, and that could have inadvertent effects to marginalized communities in country,
mm,
right? So,
mm,
yeah, I think our more progressive politics might have more questions with just with a blanket adoption of
mm,
sovereignty as a framework,
mm,
but I think yeah, they are making strides pushing this forward and trying to recruit
mm,
other researchers, civil society, and tech advocates from the South to
mm,
share their vision for digital sovereignty.
mm. I mean, I've heard a lot of discussions about digital sovereignty, and now it's AI sovereignty, data
Mm-hmm.
sovereignty, right? And I mean, coming from an authoritarian setting like I am, this term, like, as you mentioned, right, it can slip into something else, right? And I mean, we are stuck between tech power and state power that is not always trustworthy among the population. So, I mean, what we are studying at the GIGA is essentially that how, state powers capture tech terms, right? And exploit them as a weapon for authoritarian control and restrictions of civil society freedom. So, I mean, in Southeast Asia, we've seen that trends of like using laws, information laws to charge and arrest critics of governments or laws regarding surveillance to deepen surveillance systems in the country. So, how do you see this kind of dilemma? The fact that we cannot rely on tech power to protect us from digital harms, and at the same time, the state and government power can also, transform into a more kind of undemocratic practice as well. So how do you see this dilemma going forward in our region, Southeast Asia, and also in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. I think thanks for that, Janjira. And I think that's what we scholars who do a lot of work, who are from and who do work in on about Southeast Asia are really underlining and have been underlining for years, right? And I think your work has really paved the way with regard to that. The kind of caution that we try to raise when it comes to tech accountability advocacies that overly center content regulation and content judgments of right and wrong, right? That's,
Mm,
I think, the binary of like true and false, like should we keep it up or should we take it down? Like that's the kind of baseline understanding of content regulation and platform regulation that
mm,
we from Southeast Asia are like, can we think of something else? Like, because if we only just focus on content, then models from Thailand, from Malaysia,
mm,
Singapore, and these are like bad models, right? That in terms of how they create undue harm to activists, to dissidents, to critics, to academics, right? So, for me, it's about dwelling in those conflicts and disagreements to
mm,
really deepen understanding about those divergences that we can develop a more comprehensive
mm,
strategy
mm,
um, that would be customized, respectful, mindful of specific country level issues and vulnerabilities.
mm,
So
mm,
the op-ed that you mentioned that I had written for the Carnegie Network, it's based on a study entitled Custom Built Reforming Tech and Democracy Programs for the Global Majority or the Global South. And here, we're trying to come up with a framework, and one of the appendices of this study kind of like delineates what should be priority programs and advocacies if, for example, a country has its regulatory institutions captured. And
mm,
I think
mm,
that's exactly what you're saying, right? For Southeast Asia, our regulatory institutions tend to be very, very much aligned with incumbent powers, advancing illiberal interests, and
mm,
trying to consolidate a power of the state further by incorporating big tech within it and within their frameworks
mm,
of securitization. So I think that's what would be better approaches to fund. For me, in that context, it's much more those community-driven,
mm,
bottom-up frameworks that are trying to educate communities, mobilize communities from the
mm,
grassroots. The outcomes are not as immediate, are not as like visible, and like will it won't catch headlines of okay, Zuckerberg fined $1 billion, which is often what funders want to fund, right? Like they want to fund like a team of lawyers to capture the biggest faults of Meta within specific jurisdictions. But that's not
mm,
what would be the most meaningful or beneficial and strategic to specific countries where regulatory initiatives could be so easily co-opted
mm,
by the incumbents. And I think, yeah, our countries are the ones, for example, sharing again from the South to South Learning Exchange. We had one workshop where the Brazilian policymakers, who were
mm,
very proud about their aggressive content moderation decisions, were justifying their actions in the last elections in Brazil. And we had some people pushing back from India and Indonesia
mm,
in the audience, saying that you might be celebrating now, but if you learn from Indonesia and India, yeah, like there's a lot to be afraid of in the future.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I often have that question because often depends on who's in power, right? And I mean, sometimes you have good actors, sometimes you have bad actors, and once the laws are implemented, then it's quite difficult to overdo that, to just basically overturn that, sorry, yeah, right? So I mean, when bad actors are in power, then the tendency is they can exploit these regulatory measures. I was thinking, when I was at IGF this year, upon your colleague's invitation, there were a lot of discussions regarding guardrails, right? So you can basically regulate platforms and try to create normative guardrails around that. Can you give us some examples of sort of, the kind of guardrails that work in the global south, providing like counteraction to the executive powers that could exploit regulations for, powers capture?
Yeah, great question, Janjira. I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't begin with I won't begin with like examples from a kind of like legal standpoint of national level legislation, for example, that could enforce those guardrails. But my approach is working with civil society and seeing what those multi-stakeholder coalitions could enforce in a more bottom-up fashion. So and my good examples also come from Brazil in a way. Um, One example that many Brazilian colleagues always turn to is what they call a disinformation articulation room, which I think is their fancy term to talk about a very diverse coalition that was composed of researchers, legal scholars, social scientists, computational researchers, journalists, and policymakers working with each other in the context of the lead up to their 2022 elections. And when I would ask our respondents for our study examples of what were you most proud of, they won't pinpoint immediately like a tool or a project or a paper that they had written or a legislation that was authored, but they point to the collaboration that they experienced, where having diverse sets of eyes and ears helped them to have a very comprehensive strategy around counter disinfo, around tech accountability. And I found that quite different from other countries that we interviewed. So a lot of countries in Southeast Asia were more recipients of funding to implement just one methodology. So 50 organizations funded only to do fact checking. And they're all applying the same methods. And so the kind of diminishing returns of that approach is very much evident when we encountered and interviewed, for example, grassroots youth organizers. I mean, their talent is really to go down on at the community level to get voters out, to inspire the youth, etc., etc. But the funding that they would receive kind of forced them to retrain themselves as a fact checker, just like any other news outfit. And so the Brazilian model that we found in contrast was much more, okay, lean into your strengths, see what are the gaps in the ecosystem, and therefore find your niche, find your unique methodology that you can contribute. And that requires a lot of coordination, a lot of collaboration, and funders being flexible and open-ended too. And I think that's one of the arguments that our study is trying to push forward, that we need this much more creative, open-ended approach. And I think having diverse sets of eyes and ears help in instituting those guardrails, help when it comes to speaking to platforms and saying that, hey, if this approach is advanced, this might cause undue harm to specific marginalized communities, because that is often what is overlooked
Mm,
by by a lot of like tech accountability and tech regulation. It's
mm,
those community organizations that are advocating for oppressed communities within country, that
mm.
their advocacies are often not the priority because it's so, in a way, seen as so marginal, right? And I think that's what my research has been trying to place more attention on. Yeah.
Mm, fantastic. I mean, I often feel working in this project, this is our extended phase already, right? And in the first phase, we kind of worked primarily with fact-checking organizations and at the same time with digital rights advocates, people who defend dissidents who posted something problematic online and they were charged. And so, I mean, my feeling is that there's often like a gap between these two streams of digital research and advocacy. On the one hand, you have a lot of CSOs promoting information integrity, information literacy, but on the other hand, you have digital rights workers promoting rights and defending freedoms in online space, right? So how do you bridge this kind of gap and negotiate the tensions, if you like?
Well, I was hoping you would answer that, Janjira, but precisely, I think that this is where our interests, and that's why I cite your work a lot and learn from you a lot. I think this is where our key interests really converge. I think between those two groups that you outline and that you contrast, they subscribe to quite different models of democracy and understandings of how the media operate, right? Like there's a more liberal democratic model that journalists, fact checkers tend to kind of subscribe, and therefore that lens is how they diagnose our current state under social media or under Gen AI, where the problem, as is, and I will just caricature the problem in their terms, is that how come ordinary citizens have lost faith in the traditional institutions of knowledge and the gatekeepers of knowledge, right? Of the press, of academia, of science, things like that, and therefore it's about reverting back to like a public sphere ideal model. While um, uh, I'm testing this out, and I want to hear what you think, Janjir. While I think the problem, as articulated by some, maybe not all CSOs and more progressive digital rights groups, is understanding as well that there are fundamental flaws in the information ecosystem as we know it and as we have always known it. There was never like an ideal public sphere to begin with, and it is about working with the marginalized communities and the less heard voices that a lot of these digital rights groups, also those advocating for gender issues around gender and feminism, right? Issues also around race and racial justice. There are a lot of those active groups also in the Brazilian context. And there, it's about advocating for the needs of minoritized communities, of migrants as well, and so not the typical view of, yeah, like the citizen in a specific country, right? But those who are existing in the margins. And I think those are two quite different priority sets when it comes to what they want platforms to do, what they want government actors to fund and support, what rights are more important in a way, or are to be seen as having um, or protections that are more important for specific communities, right? So I think that's where some of those divergences happen. And again, it's not about one is better than the other, but it's in some contexts legislation that means well, that means well to support, mainstream media, to support legacy media, to support fact checking, right? That's important. It's important um, to have access to the truth, to hold politicians into account with what they say. So we're not saying, I'm not saying that we shouldn't fund fact checking, but an overemphasis on certain kinds of institution building would also we would also need some support for more bottom-up organizing, grassroots organizing, and building stuff that are directly relevant to communities. So one example I often give, again, and now I put my hat on as a researcher here in the United States, is for migrant communities here in the US, the issue of disinformation is often framed as, why don't Filipino Americans or Vietnamese Americans read enough and or listen to CNN or NBC or Washington Post, New York Times? But if you talk to these migrant groups, is that these news agencies, these news platforms do not talk about their issues, caricature them as in very simplistic terms, perpetuate stereotypes. And so why should they trust these institutions to begin with? And that's why I love working with people who do community media and migrant media. And I think those are the people who kind of have a very specific group in mind in terms of what are the information needs of this community that is underserved and not seen in the mainstream. And we need to have this lens as well in the global south. Like, who are those communities that we do not see in our media, who we do not pay attention, who we do not pay attention to, and whom we take for granted that, like what our national media outlets and news outlets produce, we just assume that that's what they should consume as well.
Yeah, this is an excellent point because I think it comes down to, power relations, right? And, if it's about unheard voices and overheard voices. And sometimes, disinformation targeting a powerful group and a less powerful group has totally different impact, right? And I think that can be like a bridge that connects these two streams of work together, because both researchers and advocates in both fields focus on basically making unheard voices heard as well.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And to add to that, so Janjira, you're talking about bridging digital rights groups with more progressive bent community media outlets, which have a very specific underserved population in mind, to loop them in the big coalition of counter disinfo or tech accountability, which is often a space dominated by mainstream media and journalists. Right? So I think that's what we're trying to underscore. I also want to emphasize that academic researchers need to be part of this discussion too. And academic researchers from the Global South, who are experts in the Global South, need to be leading these discussions too. What bad practices that we have uncovered is that Global South researchers are not treated the same way as Global North researchers in the tech accountability and tech policy spaces. They, or rather, let me use the pronoun we, are often treated as authors of case studies, right? Like, you're going to write about Thailand, Jonathan is going to write about the Philippines, but the framework is going to come from the US, or the solution or the intervention is designed from Brown University, right? No offense to Brown University, they're great, but we have amazing researchers on the ground who have been doing research, working with communities,
Mm.
and have been tracking our elections over time. And so um, I think, and I speak to a lot of graduate students from the Global South about this as well. We tend to do it ourselves, that we kind of like see a framework, a theoretical framework, an approach, a concept from the Global North, and then we apply it to the Global South and we apply it to our case rather than seeing the specificity and the uniqueness and also the global relevance of our specific contexts as something that produces knowledge and theory as well. And I think that's what our work should be guiding, what coalitions are doing, should be guiding what interventions are implemented, right? Rather than see knowledge and solutions coming from the North to be implemented from the South. So I think that's where I see again great examples from Brazil in terms of how academics work directly with journalists, work in relation to policymaker, where I don't know whether you agree, Janjira. In Asia, I feel that there is a divide between academia and practitioners that is a bit wider and bigger, and I wish we can also bridge that too.
Yes, absolutely. I do agree. And parts of my work in Thailand focus on bridging that gulf as well between policy, practitioners, policy, and civil society advocacies. Last question, Jonathan. Is time is always short. Talking to you is always great fun, great pleasure, and I always learn a lot from you and your research. Now,
Likewise.
it's been fun. We should have like 2 hours of this discussion. Now, funding is one of the greatest challenges that we are facing, right? And we've been talking about like grassroots work, supporting ground up research. But then again,
Mhm.
funding that we've received is often coming from the global north and tech sector, and now is dissipating, right? Looking forward, how can we find a sort of sustainable approach towards financial resources and sustaining this work that civil society in the global south has been doing by relying less on resources from the global north?
Wow. Wow. Yeah. Ending with a big question, Janjira. Uh, yeah, but absolutely on top of everybody's minds. And yeah, our work, the study custom built was a critique of funding practices um, in previous years, but recent developments that really started, yeah, in January of this year has been how the Trump administration, I think that's a key point, right? Like Trump administration has systematically dismantled institutions such as U.S. aid and some of the foreign aid assistance programs that have supported a lot of information ecosystem work in the global south, media development work, tech and democracy work in the global south. And as much as my work has criticized the kind of like foreign policy dimension of some of these programs, which are nudging global south researchers to align with US geopolitics and their and foreign policy. Now that these institutions have been dismantled very successfully and very quickly, and to yeah such and there's so much human costs here, right? Like a lot of workers have been laid off, very incredible policymakers who have, in a way, led some of the discussions in the space, yeah, have lost jobs in the past months, and it's been heartbreaking to see. But also on the ground, a lot of civil society organizations are struggling to survive and trying to find new sources of funding. Um, for some of the civil society organizations that we have continued to work with and to participate in, there's a lot of scaling back of efforts and just trying to focus on their key priorities. I think one of the quote unquote good things that might come out of this and have come out of this is civil society organizations just double down on what they think are their biggest priority and biggest advocacy. So some of the stuff that they had, in a way, tried to do a lot of like, chasing the funding cycle, that is happening less in a way. So again, the key priorities are coming out, but yeah, organizational resilience and sustainability is on top of everybody's minds. I don't think funding from platforms themselves, right, would be sustainable moving forward. We have seen fact-checking programs having been rolled back also since January of this year. So yeah, I think it's quite a scramble. I think it's a lot of moving targets, and there are certain funding cycles that have been opened up with artificial intelligence, which makes me also very skeptical, and I'm not hopeful as well, right? Like it's another big boom in a way that counter disinfo was a boom, that and a lot of like breakneck speed, like funding around AI. But what is truly meaningful to communities, I hope that is a key question on top of everybody's minds, right? Like, yeah, AI funding for whom, right? Like, who are we serving? Like, who are we propping up at the end of the day? Like, is it really meaningful to the people that I'm working with and that whose needs I'm trying to address? I hope that's what on people's minds are.
Excellent. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about that as well, right? Who basically determines research agenda in our field, and is again the question of money, power, and politics, right? So I think that I mean, this conversation will be continued, and we are at the beginning of AI hype and AI research hype, so we will see a lot to emerge. Jonathan, thanks so much for your great insights and excellent input today. Thanks so much for taking the time in your morning, and I hope to chat again.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Congratulations again with the podcast. And I hope the listeners continue to tune in. Expect such great things from Janjira and her team.
Thank you.